Good evening, everyone. I'm really hoarse, so I sound a little bit more sultry than I normally would. Um, Thank you. I'm Sandra Jackson Dumont. I am the Frederick P. and Sandra P. Rose Chairman of Education here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Met Fridays, where there's something new and different to experience at the museum every Friday night through performances, art making, conversations like the one you're going to hear tonight, and more. Our Artist on Artwork series tonight is presented in conjunction with the exhibition, the amazingly beautiful and wonderful exhibition, David Hockney, on view until February 25th. The exhibition, organized collaboratively by the Tate Britain, the Centre Pompidou, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, presents Hockney's most iconic works and key moments of his career from 1960 to the present. Before I introduce our speakers this evening, I want to thank our donors for making this exhibition possible. We couldn't do it without them. The Horace W. Goldsmith Foundation, the J. Pritzker Foundation, the Jane and Robert Carroll Fund, the Aaron I. Fleischman and Lynn Lougheed Fund, Alston Chapman, and the Federal Council on the Arts and Humanities for providing indemnity support for this project, which is really crucial. Artist on Artwork, this series, is an opportunity to explore works of art on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art through the unique perspectives of someone who makes art themselves. Sharing with us her reflections on the work of David Hockney and insights on her own artistic practice is my friend, an incredibly talented and extremely acclaimed artist, Mickalene Thomas. We are thrilled to have her here this evening. Joining her in conversation is my other friend and colleague, Ian Alteveer, curator in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, who organized this incredible exhibition for the Met. And to begin our program, we'll hear from Ian for a brief overview and highlights of the exhibition. Please join me in welcoming Ian Alteveer.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and I'm thrilled that Mickalene Thomas is here with us tonight. This whole conversation was occasioned a few months ago when I went to the studio to see some of the work that she was working on for an exhibition that opens just next month at the Seattle Art Museum. And it's going to be an amazing show. It's a three-person show, 3 generations of artists called Figuring History. Robert Colescott, Carrie James Marshall, an artist very close to my own heart, and Mickalene Thomas. So I really look forward to the chance of seeing that show. But in the process of that kind of visit, Thomas asked me what I was working on. And I mentioned this David Hockney project, and she said something along the lines of, oh, well, he's one of the reasons why I am an artist. And I was fascinated to hear that. And we'll get to maybe find out a little bit more about why that is when we sit down for a conversation. But first, I thought it would be good to introduce the work. And if I could get the first slide up here. Nope, I went too far. There we go. Mickalene Thomas, and so I'll introduce Mickalene Thomas's work and then give you a really quick overview of the show to set the stage for our conversation. She was born in 1971 in Camden, New Jersey, and she lives and works today in Brooklyn, New York. Her signature material, for those of you who know the work, is the rhinestone, in addition to wonderfully bright areas of enamel and acrylic paint. And the rhinestone, of course, is symbolic in many ways. In popular culture, these complex portraits of women, in sort of full on in their power and beauty, sparkle with this layer of glittery material. And in a way, it serves as a symbol both of femininity and decoration, but it also symbolizes, in a way, artifice as well, and the way in which the way we put ourselves together may create a kind of performance. She is also a wonderful maker of collages, and they often form sources for the larger paintings. And here you see a great collage, an odalisque, and so the language of art history also courses through Thomas's work, all the way back to the Renaissance and through 19th century painting. Another great collage here, someone very near and dear to the artist's heart. And here photographic sources, both images taken by the artist herself and clippings from magazines and catalogs and other decorative elements, speak to a very hybrid language of art making. Thomas is also known for her wonderful installations, which in a way reproduce on a kind of higher level scenes of domesticity from the time in which she was growing up and just before that. And of course, the references here to the kind of living rooms of homes from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, these are times in our history of great upheaval, times of the civil rights movement, times of the feminist movement. And so these environments, which are replete with wonderful images made by the artist herself, which speak to, again, these wonderful figures of feminine power, in a way reconfigure those spaces for a different view. There's also her incredible film work. And here I'm showing you installation views from a recent exhibition at her New York gallery, Lehman Mopin, when it used to be in Chelsea, and videos about women combined with these interiors, these domestic interiors, take the work to a durational space that is also really wonderful. There's also a whole performance aspect to her practice that we'll see a little bit of at the end of our conversation. I hope that gives you a good introduction to Thomas's work, which we'll get back to very shortly. And I'm sorry, I'm just showing you here, there's also now entering the work, these wonderful smoky mirrored silk-screened panels, figures that may be recognizable to you from popular culture and history, people like Diana Ross, for example. And one then also sees oneself reflected back in these wonderfully complex works. To talk about the exhibition that's upstairs in our Cantor galleries, in our Cantor exhibition hall. This is the first retrospective for this important artist in New York City in almost 30 years. And it's a bit of a homecoming for Hockney because the Met hosted his last retrospective here in 1988. There's been very few opportunities in the meantime, though, to see work, for example, like this one, Tiger painting number 2 from 1960, made in Hockney's very first year in London when he was in his 3-year graduate course at the Royal College of Art. Work that speaks to the lingua franca of the day, of the 1950s and 60s abstract painting, but which already layers on elements of text, that floating letter E, for example, and even the title of the work, Tiger with a Y, references the great romantic poet William Blake. So already adding in extra sources into the work and extra meanings in abstraction. Very soon, Hockney layers even more text into the work. And in this third love painting, also from 1960, on the bottom right there, you might be able to make out a block of text, which is a stanza from the poetry of Walt Whitman, a great American poet who Hockney greatly admired, mainly for his frank and beautiful descriptions of same-sex attraction and love. And that's Hockney's queer sexuality, which he had been beginning to explore in these early years in London, begins to invade the work in a really powerful and forceful way at this moment. His dear friend at the Royal College, R.J. Kitai, the American painter, told him to paint what he was passionate about. And indeed, both being passionate about vegetarianism, and we don't have any in the show, but there's paintings of carrots and lettuce. There's also Hockney's real exploration of gay desire. And that begins to emerge in works such as this one, very early on. And at a time, I might add, when homosexuality was explicitly outlawed in the UK and it was not decriminalized until the Sexual Offenses Act passed in 1967. So in a way, for a young artist in his 20s, something very brave to do indeed. Hockney graduates from the Royal College in 1962. He wins a medal. He accepts his prize in a gold lame jacket. He's already been kind of working on his style. The year before, in 1961, he saw an ad for hair dye here in New York City on a summer visit that said blondes have more fun. He decided to see what would happen if he bleached his hair, and indeed, I think he probably did start having more fun. He was also then, in that year after graduating, in 63, fantasizing about Los Angeles. And he'd been reading about LA through the stories of John Recke, for example, the author of City of Night, who wrote noirish fiction about gay hustlers in downtown Los Angeles. He was also Hockney was collecting beefcake magazines like Physique Pictorial, published by Bob Miser in LA in the 50s and 60s, which depicted scantily clad, very sporty-looking young men frolicking in showers and swimming pools. And so Hockney's erotic fantasies about Los Angeles as a city of freedom, both sexually and also, I think, artistically, one where he could develop a language all his own, began to occupy his thoughts. And when he sold out his first show at John Casman Limited in December of 63, he finally had enough money to move to LA, which he does in January of 64. Here, one of his first paintings from those years of a California art collector, an amalgam of the women he had met, going around Beverly Hills with his dealer, John Casman, in the spring of 64. They're the first depiction of a swimming pool in Hockney's work, a thing, of course, that is ubiquitous in Southern California, but very hard to find in England. The palette, of course, changes in Los Angeles, and Hockney begins to use acrylic paint to render those bright, flat, sunny surfaces of boxy Los Angeles buildings and sunny backyards with swimming pools. And here in The Bigger Splash from 1967, he takes 2 weeks to painstakingly render a splash that took just an instant to occur. And I think finds wonderful tension in the way in which its careful rendering and the very kind of details that he brings out in the paint contrast with the very flatness of those blues and pinks of the sky, the house, and the pool. By the early 70s, he changed the way he paints water. And here he's using a soak stain technique, diluting the paint way, way down and adding a surfactant so it soaks into the canvas, very literally bleeding almost into the fibers, to render a beautiful sunny poolside now here in the south of France. By the 70s, he was back in Europe. But first, before leaving LA, he embarked on a fantastic project of painting double portraits, trying to capture the tension between people's relationships. Here, his very dear friends, Christopher Isherwood, the author, on the right, and Don Bachardy, the painter, on the left. Isherwood looks at Bachardy, who looks out at Hockney, or rather out at us, and we join them in this triangular gaze. All along, Hockney is drawing, and his wonderful and intimate portraits that are represented by 21 excellent examples in the show. This one, a picture from 1966 of his then boyfriend, Peter Schlesinger, asleep on a bed, is joined by many other great examples. Here, his friend, the fashion designer Ossie Clark, in London in the early 70s, wearing a Fair Isle sweater, rendered here in colored pencil. But I think this atmosphere of picturing friends and intimates is something that Hockney might share with Mickalene Thomas. And then there's experimentation with things like photography, iPads, and embracing of new technologies. Here, a portrait of his mother in the early 1980s, back in Yorkshire, where you see at the very bottom the tips of Hockney's brogues as he shoots picture after picture after picture to compose the scene in a way to break apart, perhaps, the tyranny of the one-point Western perspective of Renaissance painting. And indeed, that's what he does throughout the 80s and 90s when he moves back to LA, embraces a new brand of acrylic paint that is very bold in color and deep in pigment. And his view of the landscape changes. Indeed, here, not a landscape format, but rather a portrait format of a road he was very familiar with at that time in 1980, Nichols Canyon Road, for he moved in those years up into the Hollywood Hills and took those winding canyon drives every day back and forth to the studio. That experience of a landscape over time, a winding road across hills, here the Pacific Coast Highway with Santa Monica in the distance, kind of meshed with his interest in the synesthetic experience of things like opera, which he had been designing throughout the 80s, stage sets for major opera companies like the Met here in New York, the other Met, we like to call it. And then in the early 2000s, he's back in England. And the return of this kind of vanishing point at the end of this long lane, his favorite site near his childhood home, that he affectionately calls the tunnel for its arc of branches overhead, is mitigated in a way by the multiple panels that he uses to make up these compositions. And so I would say it's not necessarily a traditional return to this Western perspective and to oil painting, but rather continues these experiments in thinking of space in different ways. And I think we'll talk about this in a moment, but many of you may have seen this exhibition, an exhibition here in New York in 2009 that included this picture that is one of the kind of sparking points for me and for Mickalene Thomas. The show ends with some remarkable new paintings that are occasioned by Hockney's return to California and to that Hollywood Hills house that he loves so much, which is with its lush backyard and its swimming pool that you see there below and its cobalt blue deck. And there's a picture that Hockney painted just this past March. The one made right before this, the perspective in it begins to get a little wonky. And then that occasioned Hockney's sort of stroke of genius to cut off the bottom corners of the canvas to see if that would help him force the perspective back out in reverse so that we now see a full 180-degree view of that beloved blue terrace in the backyard, in a way bending that space to embrace us. And it's occasioned a whole new suite of paintings done on canvases shaped just this way, which we will be really excited to see this coming spring, also at Pace Gallery here in New York. So I hope that gives you a good intro to the show and a good intro to Mickalene Thomas's work as well. And I'm going to ask her to join me on the stage now, where we will talk much more about Hockney and his work. Come on down.
I'm walking slow, not because of my shoes.
Because you're scared.
No, because that too, but my arch dropped.
Oh.
But I'm here.
I'm so happy you're here.
Would you like some sake?
I would love some sake.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
So, like they say, when you're
after.
scared, make it at your home. So
Yeah.
I'm bringing you to me.
That's so great. And I think actually that's a lovely start in a way to the conversation, because I feel like that's what some of your installation work does, right? It's about, thank you, kampai.
Kampai.
Yum. Isn't it? I mean, it's about creating spaces of domestic spaces in which one experiences that space differently than if you were in a living room, just a regular one. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the spaces that I create is mainly probably about desire, mm-hmm. And desire and memory and longing. Mm. And so I think initially when I began making these spaces, it was mostly about composition. Mm-hmm. And what was familial to me. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it was also a way of trying to really define my subject in the space. And so what made sense to me was to use photography as that tool. Mm-hmm. and use photography as the tool to capture the image for compositions for future paintings. And by doing that, I would first start with a backdrop, you know, with
So
the sitter.
So you would stage
I would
them.
stage it
Yeah.
and start, you know, maybe there was a fabric behind the model, and then that wasn't enough for the space. And I think thinking of pictorial space and then the depth of field and what I was seeing, we had a conversation earlier about, you know, the lens of the camera, of how you know, Hockney and how he sees the space. And so I think for me, using photography and trying to understand composition, the tableaus begin to evolve.
And so photo, in a way, that use of, so Hockney in the kind of photo work of the early 80s was really interested in exploding that single lens, that what he called the kind of cyclops of the camera, and thinking about how that doesn't really capture the way in which we actually see.
No, because we have, you know,
We have two
eyes.
Yeah, most
So
of us.
you're looking at one lens, and I think for me, that's how I was trying to make sense of the spaces I was trying to create. And I think that's how collage played a huge part in my process. Thinking and trying to make sense of the space by juxtaposing and cutting and pasting images together and layering them, and then figuring out the order of the figure within all of this pattern and fabric that I had within the space. Using the figure for me as the quiet noise within the cacophony of pattern and layers.
I'm just looking for one of your, and we'll talk about these landscapes, sorry. So starting with photos. Against backdrops.
Against backdrops.
Right.
And
you see, I think, in a work like this, how that patterning then becomes part of the painting behind. And
I think for this particular one, what was happening, it was well after I was photographing my mother. You know, I started photographing my mother in early 2000 when I was in graduate school. And so this was about 2008, 2009. I realized that a lot of my paintings felt very graphically forward and flat. And so I started I think this was probably about the time where I really started looking at fashion magazines and or found resources or other magazines that I collect, such as Jet and Ebony magazines. And really looking back, I was an avid collector. My mother was an avid collector of the Jet magazines because of the beauties of the week. And so wanting to make my mother shine in that way. And so I remember looking at one magazine, and it just had these really geometric patterns in the background of a figure, and I thought that was just another way to add sort of space. But it was still very flat. I don't know if I was quite successful with that. But
I love this painting in a way because of its it has a graphic quality, but there's also the three-dimensionality that happens in your paintings when you attach the rhinestones.
Yeah.
So they have an impasto that's not necessarily made out of paint, but sometimes it is.
Yeah, I think the rhinestone's almost like a third dimension.
Yeah.
You know, it acts this three-dimensional space, even though it's about materiality. And for me, what I like about this painting is I felt like I captured that moment of excitement in my mother. And so the background reflected that. But the rhinestones, you know, although they're, you know, in some ways people talked about them as an accoutrement and all of that, but as I use them and they've evolved in my practice over time, I feel like they've developed their own language. And I've begun to understand as an artist that use my studio practice as a way of working through my own ideas, that they begin to allow me to understand what they're really used for. Sort of, you know, the idea of artifice and, you know, just like how we see ourselves and perceived through beauty and all of these other notions of beautification and embellishment. And so that became really exciting for me, because in the beginning, how I started using the rhinestones was just really about formalism. And it was through Seurat and pointillism that I got through using rhinestones, because I've always, since undergrad, worked with untraditional materials. I had a great love with like just, you know, working with fabrics and just craft materials, going to, you know, Michael's craft store and using materials in that nature, sequins, and really felt like through Seurat, and the only reason why I found Seurat is because I was looking at French Impressionism, and he seemed to relate closely to Aboriginal art that I was looking at the time.
I see.
Aboriginal art, and then using the rhinestones, which reflected and reminded me of sort of these like Ben-Day dots or something that you could use with color. And so it made sense
well, I also
through
like
composition and material.
You must have been drawn to Impressionist painting as well, because it is a kind of, it represents everyday life, right? It represents ideals of beauty, fashion, modernity, but also what's going on in the interior. There's you know, nightclub scenes, and there's a kind of rhetoric there of contemporaneity, of city life, of urbanity, but Seurat is fascinating, and I think you probably remember that painting in Hockney's show of the French window in the Louvre, which he calls contre-jour in the French style. And I think that French style, he talks about in the title, it's a painting from 1974 when he was living in Paris, is in part that pointillist
I
stroke
feel like
he uses
there's a
for
lot
the
of
walls.
overlap in our work. And indirectly and directly without me looking at him. I don't want to give anyone the impression that he's been like a really great inspiration and sort of mentor. He's someone I've looked at, not to the extent as I looked at Romeo Burton or like, you know, Jacob Lawrence or like a Matisse by any means, but he is one that I often would go to when I'm thinking of composition, and just find that there was this parallel at some points of, you know, how he used Matisse and, you know, and pointillism and just like sort of even the collage with his photographic collages. I think he calls them something else.
He original sort of experiments, and then were called joiners.
Joiners, that's the word. He called them joiners, and just how he layered them. And that was always very exciting for me to find, you know, that parallel in conversation with a contemporary artist who is of a different generation and still alive, you know. And I remember in 2009, I believe it was at Pace, where he had his landscape paintings. And I had just begun my series of landscape paintings. And
I've got a few of those in here.
It was 2009, and I remember walking to Pace Gallery, and I was like, excuse my French, you motherfucker. You know?
Because you had already started the landscapes.
Because I already started them.
So
and I
think
was
they're
like,
back.
oh, well, I can't do these anymore, you know?
Did you really feel that way?
I did. I did, and I had just started looking at the Hudson River School painters, you know, Thomas Cole and
Moran
and Frederick
Church.
Frederick Church. And because I was visiting a friend who was living up in Hudson, and so I was like back and forth traveling, visiting him at the time, and so just thinking about that history of travel and just being out of the city and just thinking about who you are in various places.
Or maybe also the pastoral too, right?
The
that
pastoral,
this is a landscape that's available to you
it was like,
as well.
it was available to me, but it was really exciting. It's like, oh, wow, so this is what they were looking at, you know? And, you know, I'm definitely not a plein air painter, or, you know, that's not my style, but I responded to the landscape for the first time, and just felt the need to use that as a way to think about myself, but also the figure in that space, and the absence of the figure, as you will, as well. And so when I saw the Hockney show, I thought, oh, okay, there's some synergy there. But what I really responded to with his paintings were, the electric, vivid colors that he used, but also just I felt like I was, because of his sense of perspective, I felt like I was in the forest. I felt like that I was right where
that you're standing there next to him by the side of the road as he's painting.
He was successful in putting me in the place that he wanted me to be as the viewer. And I always try to think about how to do that as an artist. How do you put the viewer where you want them to be? And that's always a question that I ask when I'm making, like, where do you want the viewer to stand, and how do you want them to feel when they're standing in front of your work? And that's also how I thought about the shift of scale in my work. And that's why I felt that my figures, specifically using the black women, demanded a very specific type of grandeur. And moment, and
the scale of history painting or of grand portraiture.
And sort of like something very, the monumentality of sort of the grandeur of the force of this reclining figure. I remember when I did
your Grand Odalisque.
The Grand Odalisque painting, that I did that, and I called mine the Grand Odalisque, that is at the Brooklyn Museum. I remember when I did that, it was my first 9x12 painting, and which was a challenge because I was making that in a basement studio where the ceiling height was like 8 feet.
So was it at an angle then?
So no, I made it flat. So I actually didn't see it up until it was hung in the gallery. But I knew while I was making that that it was going to have some impact, and that's what I want. And so just going back to my experience with Hockney's paintings in 2009, it gave me that allure and shifted my way of thinking with space.
I think that was an incredible show, and sort of breakthrough. And we were talking earlier today about responses to Hockney's work over the years. And the last retrospective here in 1988 did not get great reviews. And we talked about how maybe that was a time of a reaction against painting, for example. And it was Roberta Smith who
reviewed that show.
Who reviewed that show in '88 and who reviewed the show in 2009 and super glowingly. And she said that was her conversion moment for Hockney. I also love what you said about those works and about the Hudson River School, because I think that's something Hockney's thought about too.
Okay.
He went in the 90s to see a show of the Grand Canyon paintings by Thomas Moran. And that inspired him to revisit that site, a site he loves, that monumental natural wonder, which he had stopped at many times over the years driving to and from LA. It was one of his favorite spots to go. And he decided to embark on a new series of Grand Canyons, and that's what generated that huge 60-panel work that's now in Australia, too big to bring over for our exhibition. But I represented in the show with those two sort of study versions. But you get the sense of him wanting to push the landscape out, make it kind of something that will consume you as a viewer, right? Or that you're standing there at the precipice of the canyon, feeling like you're going to be in it, or that you are there.
I always wondered, because I felt like there are times that I and Hockney were like two passing ships in the night. And I don't know why. I remember when I went to Giverny, France.
Yes.
And he spends a lot of time at Monet's estate.
He loves France,
And so...
I'm just going to go forward because you have a collage.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that was actually me also looking at Hockney while I was in Monet.
Using photo
collage.
Yeah.
And so, oh, excuse me. And the sake is kicking in now.
It's going to get interesting.
It's going to get very interesting. I might start dancing. But I won't recline, so don't worry.
And I mean, beyond what's clearly a love of yours for French painting too, right?
Yeah.
For all of it, all the way back to Ingres too, with the odalisques, and onwards into Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. But how was the residency?
The residency was fantastic, and I remember when I was going over to France, and the host at the residency was like, "Oh, could you get here a day earlier?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't think I can. My schedule's not working out." And she's like, "I really want to make sure you get here earlier because Hockney's here." And I was like, "Well, I'll do whatever I can."
Yeah.
But it was just by a day that I missed him. And he was and what I hear from, or what I heard from the other residents and the host is that when he visits, what's very great about this residency is that it's at Monet's estate, and although there are a lot of tourists that come to visit,
Right.
as a resident, they give you the key to the garden.
That's so amazing.
So you're able to go anytime, 24/7. And my favorite part of the day to go was after hours. And so you have the entire garden to
That's
yourself.
so great.
And so I heard that Hockney liked being there by himself
That
too.
makes sense.
And so it's just and he would have his wine or whatever. And
Usually it's
or-
non-alcoholic beer.
Yeah, or
These
no,
days,
he was
but-
he smokes pot or something.
Yeah, he does.
That's what it was. It wasn't wine. I'm sorry. That he was smoking pot.
He does a lot of it,
In the garden. That's what it was.
And
Excuse me, it wasn't
cigarettes.
wine.
And cigarettes.
I knew it was some libation, but
Lots of cigarettes,
So
too.
that he had some sort of device while he was in the garden, and I just thought that was really hysterical.
Well, I mean, and if you think about it, actually it makes a lot of sense to think about you and Hockney in that garden, and the way in which that was composed by Monet as a space to kind of envelop you.
Yeah.
And especially those late water lilies, those late nymphaea, are so amazing in the way that they are meant to be all around, right? And that you are sort of immersed in the water with the flowers.
No, it's a beautiful experience. If anyone has an opportunity to go, it's just like what I like to often think about the two artists, Monet and Hockney, is that one of the things that Monet did was create his own still life to paint from.
Right.
And oftentimes when I look at Hockney's paintings, you know, like the quote that someone said to him in his youth, to paint what you love.
Yeah.
And so I often feel that he paints his environments,
Very
that
much.
he almost constructs them in a way so that he can paint from them in the same way that Monet does.
That's
and
right.
I feel like my tableaus are similar in that vein.
Creating a space to make your work.
Creating a space to make my work.
I love that, and speaking of, well, the house in the Hollywood Hills is it's like a stage set in a way, and informed by his own experience, I think, designing sets for operas, for example.
Okay.
And those bold colors he used, for example, for the Magic Flute, these bold cobalt and vermilion crimsons, and that's the way the house is painted.
Yeah.
So that deck is like this super bold blue, and there's this really lush landscape of kind of subtropical plants, and then the pool, of course, which itself is decorated with
Which
those
is
squiggles.
great. After I saw that, I was like, gosh, we should have did our pool like that in Connecticut.
You still can.
It's just like really fantastic to do like a design in the end. And when I think of Hockney's color in that sense of, I think some people may be a little put off at some of them because they can be they're this hyper fluorescent colors, and they're quite garish and sort of explosive in your face. And I feel like my color is not as hyper as his, but there's this level of pop color that is resonant and pushed forward. And I think I would like to think that both of us is like a way of like stopping the viewer, right?
Yes.
Of grabbing you and giving you a moment of like, you know, like this almost like boisterous hug. Here I am, you know, that love. And I often, when we were walking through the galleries, just looking at some of them and just trying to figure out, okay, why would he put some colors next to the other, because they don't make sense.
Right.
And I think it's through that questioning for me is a great aspiration for his work, is because I can question, because I don't always understand it.
That's great, and makes you think about it a little more.
It makes me think about it a little more.
I think you're totally right. I think both of you share this.
You're not drinking any sake. Just pointing it out. I'm almost.
Well, more.
Or did you finish?
No, I got some.
Oh, okay.
I'll finish now. There's this amazing impact, right, for both of you in your practice, that, you know, those pictures, you could see them from galleries away. Yeah. And you're right, you're sort of drawn to them, and they have impact close up, and they have impact from far away. And one of the things I love about your paintings is the kind of tension between the rhinestones and the gloss, and then the
varnish and the silk screen,
and then the flat, and then there's matte areas too sometimes, or there's wood grain, and so the way in which those things both clash and blend and meld together is another great kind of thing in your practice.
Yeah, I think the use of materiality and just various forms of painting, I would like to say, as you know, just the quality of whether it's the texture of the paint or the photographic image through the silk screen. Yeah. It's just really, for me, the excitement and love in combining sort of all of these different aspects of what is painting. Right. You know, I often think as an artist that paints, because I think of myself more as an image maker, that uses various pop cultural references in my work, and often think, what is painting and how do you paint today with so much information? Yeah. And that's what was very exciting for me when I learned in my studio one day that Hockney was using new technologies for his paintings. Yeah. And I remember, it might have been, I'm not sure, I was listening to, you know, the radio or something, an interview or something, and he was talking about the iPad. Yeah. And I had this great aversion to using new technologies, new tools like Photoshop. I would always like tease my friends about, Photoshop paintings. And then I learned that Hockney was using them. I'm like, okay, if this old man can use iPad paintings, if he's if he's diving in deep doing this, then maybe I should find a way to integrate it into my practice.
And so you use it now, Photoshop, for example?
I use Photoshop a lot. And so...
but whereas before maybe you were collaging instead, or doing it by hand.
I mean, well, just all of my collages are done by hand. Yeah. And there are some digital collages, but they're only for the paintings. Right. I've never shown them. Maybe you guys can do a show of my digital collages.
And maybe some paintings too.
Some paintings too. Two separate wings.
And so, I mean,
but they've never. But they've never been shown. So that's a body of my work that just only. Yeah. You know, stays in.
It's staying there.
It's staying there. But
Hockney's putting them out. I mean, he's making those iPad prints, right? I haven't found
the right platform for exhibiting them in the conversation, because I don't want it to be so attached to the paintings, because that is the one direct reference to my paintings, just because of all of the different processes before I get to actually making the painting. There's the installation, there's the photograph, then there's the collage, and then after the collage, I scan the image in, and then now there's a whole other thing that happens with scaling up the image. Like I remember in one of the painting that you showed, if you go back to Raquel with the purple jumpsuit, I think it was the first one.
She's in here.
The fierce Raquel just lounging in.
Some odalisques.
Yeah, not that one, but yeah, this one. Where in Photoshop, when I scanned, after scanning the collage, and I would scale up the leg, and I remember realizing how exciting that was.
That you could bend it or stretch it.
Yeah, I could really play with the composition, another layer of really reinterpreting the composition in the space. And that form of collage in itself became very, even though it's just really staying with formalism, line, color, and all of that in space, it was very exciting for me. And that was coming out of thinking about Hockney and new technologies. But for me, it's not necessarily so much of using new technologies. I also love using older technologies and analogs and combining the two. And I think that's what a lot of my videos do.
Yes.
You know, such as Mia's Muse, of really combining almost the past with the present and old with the new, of really not necessarily about new technologies, but how I can incorporate old technologies with formalists today.
I mean, I
taking
think,
like televisions and old monitors.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this tension between old and new, and sometimes when you decide to show your videos, for example, using old cathode ray tube, box TVs, it adds this extra layer of sensibility to the work, right? And reference to a time that's different from now. But I think always the work is both new and old at the same time. And with these layers of references to old master paintings or even Impressionist paintings, plus the newness of something like a glittery rhinestone or
I think that's probably,
paint.
I like to think that's probably one of the strengths of my work, is allowing some of the ideologies of the past to filter through, and thinking and using just like painting jargons and new language to sort of make and sort of mesh together all of these ideas and make sense of them.
And maybe keep painting fresh, keep it exciting.
It has to be fresh for me. It has to be exciting for me in the studio. I think sometimes I feel like when I look through, I'm like whether it's like thinking of this pixelation and one painting versus the resolution and just how one space is collage in the other, or using Polaroid as a material to make my silkscreen paintings, where one may want to discard and, just like...
Pretend that didn't happen.
Or discard the material as, because I may think of it as a resource for my material. So Polaroid in that sense is another resource for our photography, and using Polaroid as a resource for making paintings.
There's one thing, and you talked about this a little bit before, but I don't want to forget about it, and that's this question of desire in your work. And I thought that was so beautifully expressed when you said it earlier. But it's one of the things that I feel so strongly in your work, and one of the reasons why I'm so attracted to it. And it's perfect in a way to have this image of Raquel up here on the screen as someone who I know you desire very much. And the kind of the way in which that one as a viewer who may not even know her can sense that sometimes, I think is wonderful. And it's something that's brave as well, I think, to put that desire out there, and makes me think of the ways in which desire operates in Hockney's own work. And for someone who
like his homosexual propaganda.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the way in which he makes us kind of a part of that, right?
Yeah.
We are reading, we're in a way reading and looking at the same sort of things that he was getting inspiration from as we're looking at those paintings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I guess I wanted to ask you about the importance of that in the work, because I know it's big.
I guess I like to think that one of the core components of my work evokes desire, but it also gives permission to play with that as well, and in a sense where what is desire? Various forms of desire. There's sexual desire. There's familial desire. There's the aspiration of the desire to seek within the other, to see yourself. And I think there's also, the desire of the form and layers of pattern and color and how the color, and then, of course, I wouldn't think of it in the same way that Hockney does as homosexual propaganda, but more for me, the lesbian desire for the mere fact that I'm a woman who paints women. And I think that's not necessarily always on the nose of my work, but it's there. That's the residue. That's,
right.
And it's also going back to the familial thinking of my mother, right?
Yes.
It could be these Freudian aspects. You can sit and sort of, psychologically sort of put me through therapy about it, but just how I sort of started working with my mother and placing her in these environments and putting her in these clad sort of lingerie.
Yeah.
It was more about the desire to see myself in her.
Right.
And
at the same time glamorous
yes,
as well.
Yeah. And so that play for me and understanding allows me to get closer to the person that I want to be.
That's nice.
And especially with the women. And if you look at the trajectory of my work, I guess starting with my mother and looking at me, or vice versa, and then the series of muses that I've worked through, whether they're friends or lovers or friends of friends, or friends of friends of friends of friends, or wannabe friends, whatever it may be. But there's this sense for me of seeing myself in them.
Yes, and the importance too for others of being able to try and do that too, right? So I know we have only a tiny bit of time left, and I know you wanted to show. I know you wanted to show, and I wanted to show an aspect of your.
Yeah, because one of your questions, I was really good and very sort of studious.
Here, we should finish
and I
this.
actually answered all the questions.
Many of which I didn't ask.
I thought I would have to read some of them.
But you didn't.
But there is one thing that I do want to read here. It was really good. Anna helped me do this, so it was really...
Which question was it in response to?
Well, let me see. See, I was very good.
It was about
I
me
said,
too.
I'm at the Met. I have to show them I'm smart. and that I
Yes,
did go to
please.
Yale, so I know how to
Right.
do research and stuff. So, now I can't find the question, so I'm not that smart.
Well, I think I asked you about technology. I mean, we talked about that, but there was also something about your video practice, right? That maybe prompted your wanting to show this work, this performative work.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was the last question. There it is. You asked me something.
We
Here
did
it
some
is.
prep.
No, it was before that. We did do some prep. I think prep is good. It's this question. It's the question about Hockney. Did you, you said.
I said DH.
You said DH received valuable advice from classmates and friends at the Royal Academy. Who told him to paint what he loved and was passionate about? Were there any fellow artists who were similarly helpful to MT?
I was curious about that, to know, because I know many artists benefit from
Yeah.
their communities of fellow artists. And I'm always interested to know who, especially early on, maybe gave you some great prompting.
No, the question was. I had to seriously think about that. I mean, they're mentors, right? And I have
Right.
a list of them.
Sure.
And you
Yeah.
can read about them. Just
Yeah.
Google and you'll see something. But they're also, I started thinking about my experience at Yale.
Uh-huh.
And I was really infatuated with, surprisingly, Mel Bachner. When I learned that I was accepted into Yale, I was at Pratt at the time.
And you went to Yale for your master's, right?
I went to
your
Yale
MFA.
for my MFA.
Yeah.
And I learned that Mel Bachner was there. And I had one of his books. So the first day of his class, I was one of the only people to bring my book to class. And I asked him to sign it.
Yeah.
And he did. And from that day on, I would walk around like on Mel's coattails.
Oh.
And he said this to me once. So I found the quote. It's very short. When he was in my studio, "Don't be afraid to embarrass yourself."
I love that.
So that's what I think about when I make my art.
That's fabulous.
So there you go.
And
Don't be
in a way, is that a sort of an intro? Not that it's embarrassing, but an
Yeah.
intro into the way in which you spread the practice beyond painting, beyond collage, beyond photo,
Yeah.
into performance and into video.
For the first, well, not for, I mean, I did performance when I was at Yale.
Yeah.
I took a Kelly Jones class in
She's
performance art.
amazing. Yeah.
And so my first body of photographs are performative in the sense where it was a thesis work that I did for her class. And it was my first set of photographs with myself in them. But I think there's elements of performativity in my work, but I think this new performance collaboration that I'm doing, I'm very excited about. It's with Terry Lynn Carrington, four-time drummer, Grammy-winning drummer, and it started through a conversation with my partner Raquel, who met, I think, one of the directors from National Sawdust.
Yeah.
And she approached us about me doing a project with them. And I had just met Terry Lynn Carrington, and so Raquel produced this performance with this idea I had based on entropy, and it was where she would compose music to some of my videos, and it was this call and response. And at first, initially, the idea was for me to present Terry Lynn Carrington as this great jazz drummer and have her compose music with my visual images. But as the dialogue developed, I realized that I really wanted to be on stage with her. I was like, okay, I really want to be immersed in this full experience. So when I hired someone to edit the video, he taught me how to VJ, and that changed the game. Once I knew that I could actually VJ and be part of the ensemble, then I had a band.
Yeah? You're in a band.
I was in an all-girl band for the first time as one of my bucket lists. I was like,
So cool.
now I'm in a band. And
So it's a short clip, right?
it's a short clip from two performances. First at National Sawdust, the second at Smithsonian. The one we're going to show is at Smithsonian. And the reason why I'm showing it is because I'm very excited about this iteration of my practice. And we're going to perform again at the Wexner.
Nice.
And then also at the CAC in New Orleans.
In New Orleans,
Yeah.
fantastic. So should we take a look?
Yeah.
Cool. Can you cue the video? images
On
move
stage.
as
Yeah.
live. Yeah.
Dignity. Dignity depends on one's estimate of oneself. Of oneself. Self.
Well, that's a short clip.
That's it.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank you. I want to thank you, Mickalene, for joining me tonight.
My earpiece has come undone.
So that's good timing.
Yeah. I know.
No, it's been so fantastic to talk with you and to gain, I think, some real insights into your practice and Hockney's practice at the
thank you.
same time.
Thanks for inviting me.
I think a new kind of synesthetic work just like that even shows all the more how much you two have in common in strange and wonderful ways.
Yeah.
And I'm really looking forward to your upcoming shows. And I hope some of you will have the chance to see some really brilliant projects, not only the one in Seattle I mentioned, but there's also something at the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, and then some solo projects at the Wexner in Columbus.
And then in 2021 at the Met Museum.
Right. You heard it here first. Cheers. Thanks for joining.